The story of the war in Ukraine has primarily been told as a story about two countries, Ukraine and Russia. But it's also about the West. Ukraine has been able to carve out a fighting chance, mainly through a combination of its own ingenuity and innovation. But there's also a reliance on Western sanctions, Western weapons, and even whether Europe and the United States would be geopolitically aligned with Ukraine and help it come to the negotiating table from a position of strength. Meanwhile, China has been patiently waiting in the wings, reaping the benefits. They've been silently profiting by buying Russian oil on the cheap, helping Moscow keep the lights on, and smiling for the cameras at one summit after another. Other world leaders have even called the Russia-China relationship a friendship with no limits. However, that friendship is not quite limitless and seems to be rooted in China taking advantage of Russia's weak spots. You've probably heard the headline version, and it centers around Siberia. The idea is that China secretly wants its old land back, the vast territories in outer Manchuria that the Qing Empire lost to the Russian Empire in the 19th century, during what Beijing still bitterly calls the Century of Humiliation. And that version is not pure fantasy. There is real truth behind it. But it's also the part of the story that gets the most attention and tells you the least about what's actually happening. Because while everyone has been arguing about whether Chinese tanks will one day roll across the Amur River, China has been quietly going after something far more valuable and far easier to take: leverage. And that's the weak spot Russia might not be able to defend. So let's start with the part most of you already half know, because it sets the stage for everything else. The territorial grievance in outer Manchuria is real, at least partially, and Beijing has been poking at it in ways that go well beyond internet chatter. In February 2023, China's Ministry of Natural Resources issued a statement that suggested that it would use old Chinese names for 8 places along the Russian border alongside the Russian ones. Vladivostok, the headquarters of Russia's Pacific Fleet, was to be labeled Haishanwai. Sakhalin Island became Kuyedao. The Stanovoy mountain range became the outer Xing'an Range. All the changes referred to the major cities of the Russian Far East, and a foreign government had just instructed its map makers to mark them with the names of a vanished empire. The tensions didn't stop there. Earlier that year, China had already issued a directive changing the names of several locations in the region. Then in August 2023, the country's new standard map drew the entirety of Bolshoi Ussuriski Island inside China's borders. Now, this matters because back in 2008, Russia and China had formally settled the status of that island, agreeing to split it roughly down the middle. Russia even handed over a chunk of territory to seal the deal. Yet here was Beijing's official cartography 15 years later, quietly erasing that compromise and coloring the whole thing Chinese red. The same map also swallowed disputed ground claimed by India and nearly the entire South China Sea. So Russia was in crowded company. While Russia publicly dismissed the issue, arguing that the border question had already been settled, more cynical analysts believe it was a quiet message to Russia and all its other neighbors about China never forgetting its imperial extents. In May 2024, during Putin's state visit to Beijing, the two sides even signed a roadmap for the joint development of that very island. That statement by itself reads more in line with Russia putting its foot on the ground to reiterate that it owns half the island and still stakes its claim in it. By this point, most of the stories usually go off the rails because it's easy to see how they could. After all, the Russian regions bordering China have a population of only 8 million and are far from the country's population and governing centers. In fantasy land, China could swoop in and take the territory before Russia even knows what's happening. And most reports that suggest the invasion also point out that this would be exactly in line with China going for its great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation by secretly taking back the lost territories, that those parts of Russia's Far East are Chinese by right, and that a weakened Russia bogged down in Ukraine is ripe for the taking. However, a military conquest of Siberia is almost the least likely thing China would ever attempt. Russia has nuclear weapons and the border is legally settled. And crucially, the part of the Far East that China actually lost, outer Manchuria, doesn't even hold the great oil and gas reserves that the fantasy version assumes. Those are further north and west. The real story is quieter, and in a way, it's far more damaging to Russia because it's already happening and there's very little Moscow can do to stop it. China doesn't really need to invade the Russian Far East. By most counts, Russia is slowly handing out control over the Far East. For that, we have to look at the top of the map, along Russia's entire northern coastline and into the Northern Sea route. On Russia's side, this shipping lane runs from the Barents Sea near Norway all the way east to the Bering Strait. For most of history, it was frozen, useless, a white nothing. But as the Arctic ice retreats, that route is becoming one of the most strategically valuable corridors on Earth. A ship sailing from northern China to northern Europe along the Russian Arctic coast can cut its journey by 30 to 40% compared to the long haul through the Suez Canal. In October 2025, a single container ship made the trip from a port in eastern China to the United Kingdom in 20 days. The same voyage through Suez typically takes 40. Through the Cape of Good Hope, around 50. Cut your shipping time in half and you cut your fuel, your cost and your carbon all at once. For an export economy like China's, that's much more beneficial than a chunk of territory bereft of people, resources, or geopolitical interest. The northern route runs almost entirely through waters that Russia considers its own. On paper, that should make Russia the gatekeeper, collecting tolls on the most important new road in the world. The trouble is that Russia can't afford to maintain the gate. Consider the numbers Russia set for itself and then what it actually delivered. Putin signed a decree calling for 80 million tons of cargo to move along the Northern Sea route in 2024. Earlier planning documents had aimed even higher, at 90 million. But Rosatom, the state corporation that runs the route, actually reported just short of 38 million tons of cargo moved that year. Now, to be fair, that was a record, about 1.5 million tons more than the previous year. But it was less than half of the official target. And that gap alone is everything you need to dissect Russia's position in its own Arctic. Some experts have started describing the route as a black hole for the national budget, a project that swallows money and gives little back. Worse yet, Russia also missed its own targets for building the icebreakers on which the route depends. And that's the big issue with the Arctic shipping lane. It doesn't run itself, and you can't just send off a ship on a transoceanic voyage and expect it to get to the other side. To keep ships moving through the ice, you need icebreakers, ships that smash a path for everyone else. Russia still has the largest icebreaker fleet on the planet, around 40 polar vessels, including 8 nuclear-powered ones. That's a genuine advantage that the country has built up over decades, going back to the Soviet era. The crown jewels are the new Project 22220 vessels, the Arktika, the Siberia, Ural, and Yakutia. They were the largest icebreakers in the world when commissioned. But to keep that advantage, Russia needs even more ships. In one report, it suggested that Russia wants at least 13 nuclear ships and to have 17 total icebreakers available at all times. So we're looking at 5 more ships at least to be completed by 2030. And the same mechanisms that are holding up Russia in the war start showing up here. But before we get further, make sure you're subscribed to The Military Show. We post daily videos so you can keep track of all important moments in global geopolitics. Now, going back to icebreakers, it's important to mention the flagship of Russia's next-generation icebreaker ambitions, the leader-class Rossiya. It's a monster designed to be roughly twice as powerful as the Project 22220 icebreakers, reportedly capable of smashing a 50-meter wide channel through ice more than 4 meters thick. Construction started at the Zvezda yard in the Far East back in 2020, but as of early 2026, only a fraction of the ship had been completed, and its delivery date has already slipped from 2027 to 2030. The reasons are almost comical. First, key hull components were originally meant to come from a plant in Kramatorsk, which is in Donetsk, and was subsequently destroyed in the war. Then, replacement hatch covers for the ship's reactors were lost at sea when the Russian cargo vessel carrying them sank in the Mediterranean. And Rossiya is not the only snag on the project. The Chukotka, another nuclear icebreaker, was launched with great ceremony in late 2024, but sat only about 70% finish, with the initial due date of 2026 being postponed to 2027. The smaller vessels repeat the pattern. In August 2025, Russia's state port operator simply cancelled a $200 million contract for 2 new auxiliary icebreakers, blaming construction delays, missing foreign components, and sanctions. They were to have been the first Russian ships of their kind able to break 1.5 meters of solid ice, and now Russia would need to use its existing fleet that much harder while trying to maintain them. Amidst all this, China has decided it no longer wants to depend on Russian icebreakers to use the Russian Arctic. In early 2026, China unveiled the design of a next-generation nuclear-powered icebreaker capable of cutting through 2.5 meters of ice. The yard constructing it sits under the auspices of the China State Shipbuilding Corporation, one of the largest shipbuilders in the world. China is directly building the capacity to run the Arctic itself. And this was just the peak of the project. Earlier in the summer of 2025, China deployed 5 ice-breaking research vessels near Alaska, its largest such operation in the region to date. Leading that flotilla was the Xuelong 2, China's most powerful domestically built icebreaker. It had departed Shanghai in July, passed through the Bering Strait, and spent the season operating in the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas, close to both Alaska and Russia's Arctic coast. The United States Coast Guard tracked it, so did Canada. The year before, that same ship had become the first Chinese icebreaker ever to call at Murmansk, Russia's principal Arctic city. And in September 2024, Russia and China conducted their first joint Arctic patrol, made from 2 Chinese Coast Guard ships and 2 Russian border cutters sailing together through the Bering Strait. The flotilla passed within sight of Alaska on the way back into the Pacific. Now, on the surface, that joint patrol looks like a partnership. But Russia is the established Arctic power, the one with everything to protect. China is the newcomer, the one with everything to gain, and it's using cooperation with Russia today to build the experience and the hardware it will need to operate up there with or without Russia tomorrow. The Jamestown Foundation put this succinctly. Russia and China want different things from the Arctic. Russia sees it as a security zone, a question of sovereignty and defense. China sees it as an economic opportunity, a trade route, a resource base. For now, those interests run together. But analysts increasingly worry that they will not always run together and that when they diverge, the weaker partner will lose. And this is where China's own carefully chosen language comes back to haunt Moscow. Back in 2018, China declared itself a near-Arctic state and laid out its vision of a polar Silk Road. Russia didn't like that phrase. In 2020, Russia's own envoy to the Arctic Council publicly rejected it, agreeing instead with the American position that China is not Arctic. But that was the Russian line in 2020. In 2026, with sanctions strangling Russia's ability to develop the region on its own, Moscow has little choice but to welcome the very Chinese presence it once tried to keep at arm's length. The near-Arctic state that Russia rejected is now the partner Russia can't do without. If the Arctic is the strategic weak point, energy is the financial one, and here the imbalance is even worse. When Europe sanctioned Russia gas after the invasion, Russia had to find a new buyer fast, and there was really only one buyer big enough. And China, as anyone who's ever negotiated with Beijing will tell you, plays a very hard bargain. The clearest example is the pipeline known as Power of Siberia 2, Russia's great hope of replacing the European gas market it lost. It would carry up to 50 billion cubic meters of gas a year from the fields of western Siberia through Mongolia into northern China. For Russia, it is close to a strategic necessity, and precisely because Moscow needs it so badly, Beijing has spent years refusing to be hurried. In the summer of 2024, China had reportedly asked to pay close to Russia's heavily subsidized domestic price for that gas and would commit to buying only a small fraction of the pipeline's planned capacity. So, China was demanding to pay near cost and to commit to less, while Russia was the one desperate for the deal. When asked about it, the Kremlin spokesman could only say that it was completely normal for each country to defend its own interests, and that the commercial details would stay private. That's the language of a negotiator who's not winning. In 2026, after years of talks, the countries reached yet another agreement on where and how the pipeline is supposed to go. But that report also came with a caveat that other details will still need to be ironed out. This is where the core of the issue starts creeping in. China has options. It buys gas from Turkmenistan, from Myanmar by pipeline, and it's the largest single importer of liquefied natural gas in the world, with supplies from Qatar to Australia to the United States. If prices are high, it can lean on its own production or its other suppliers. Russia, by contrast, has essentially one major customer for this gas and nowhere else to send it. So China holds the upper hand in all negotiations, and everyone involved knows it. Then there is the third piece of the puzzle, the port involved in that territorial dispute we discussed earlier. In May 2023, China's Customs Administration announced that the Russian port of Vladivostok would be approved as a transit hub for Chinese domestic trade. Vladivostok is still officially labeled as Haishan Y on the Chinese map. It's the home of Russia's Pacific Fleet and a showcase of what the Russian Empire took from the Qing back in the century of humiliation. Goods from the Chinese provinces could be shipped out through Vladivostok and treated as domestic Chinese cargo, saving them the long overhaul haul to a Chinese port further south. In other words, Russian sovereign territory is being quietly folded into the logistics of the Chinese domestic economy. Chinese state media even celebrated it as a sign of high-level strategic mutual trust. Put these threads together and you start to see the shape of the strategy. China is performing a slow, patient, entirely peaceful absorption of the Russian East into its economic orbit, route by route, pipeline by pipeline, port by port. And the deeper engine driving all of it is something Russia can't fix, because it's been going in that direction for the past 30 years. The Russian Far East is emptying. Since 1990, according to research on the region, the Far East has lost something like a quarter of its population as people drift west toward Moscow and European Russia in search of work and warmth. It's now one of the most sparsely populated places on Earth, with barely one person per square kilometer across enormous stretches. Meanwhile, just across the river, the Chinese provinces of the northeast hold over 100 million people. And so the money flows in to fill the vacuum. China's consul general in Khabarovsk stated in January 2025 that over 90% of foreign investment in the Russian Far East now comes from China. At that level, the Far East is basically dependent on China without actually putting that label. With 53 Chinese companies operating in the region, they also get the say over what happens with that money and how it's doled out. This is the point at which the most dramatic claims enter the picture, and they deserve to be handled with real care because they come from an interested party. In 2025, an assessment attributed Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service argued that Russia is, in effect, paying its wartime allies in territory. According to Ukraine, Moscow's inability to develop the Far East is leaving the region open to outside control. Over time, the Kremlin could lose effective authority over as much as 40% of national territory. It claimed that up to 2 million Chinese citizens already live between Vladivostok and the Urals, forming enclaves where Russians rarely work, and it described a creeping demographic and economic annexation enabled by visa-free travel and special economic zones. It added that Chinese investment in the Far Eastern district could reach 1 trillion rubles, about $13,717,060,000 by 2026, and it pointed to a parallel North Korean labor presence, with thousands of workers arriving to fill low-wage jobs. That figure of 2 million Chinese settlers is a bit of a scarce statistic, but it's not completely ungrounded. Russia's 2010 census counted only around 30,000 Chinese residents, and that figure dropped to below 20,000 in the 2021 census. And yet Taiwan's Commission for Compatriots suggested a much staggering figure of nearly 500,000 people. An independent Russian column echoed the sentiment of 2 million Chinese people living in or around the Russian Far East, suggesting that number might have gone up to 3 million as the levels of bilateral Russia-China trade keep pushing records. But you don't even need the last part for the entire story to still make rounds. Strip away the inflated numbers and the wartime spin, and the hard verifiable core is still there. And it's still bad for Russia. It has an Arctic route that it can't maintain, a lack of shipbuilding capabilities where China is unilaterally declaring itself an Arctic state and starting to push its own ships through, and a lack of alternative options in global geopolitics. That's why the smart framing is not whether China will invade. Almost no serious analyst expects tanks. Russia is playing for today, because today is all a country fighting an expensive war can afford to think about. China is playing for the decades after. And in a contest like that, between the partner who needs the deal now and the partner who can wait, patience is its own kind of conquest. Meanwhile, China can afford to make and stake claims. An Italian think tank, ISPI, reminded that China can effectively strip away foreign claims in disputed territory. It's what happened to everyone in the South China Sea when China built 27 new military bases. And with Vladivostok becoming a part of China's domestic shipping route, and with an overwhelming amount of foreign investment, China can nudge that shipping route to where it needs to go, or even deny the opportunity for Russian companies to do the same. But the big issue here is that despite all this, China and Russia still have some common ground on which to tread: international politics. As such, conflict between China and the US can spill over to a global one quite quickly, and there are 5 ways one could start as soon as 2026, which you can check out in this video. And as always, make sure to subscribe to The Military Show for more news on global geopolitics.